Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If we can get everybody to take their seats, please. I'm John Toole, Executive Director and CEO of the Computer History Museum, and welcome. It's an incredible crowd this evening. This may be one of the few evenings that if you make innuendos about fathers of internets, there may not be laughter across the room. Because these are the people, and you in the audience, as well as Bob and others, that really did make all of that happen, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Let me tell you a couple of things, just briefly, about the museum. We've really had a terrific calendar year 2006. It's probably one of our best years ever for a lot of reasons. We brought in some incredibly great new people. We had 4 new trustees: Teresa Ming, Peter Karpus, Kurt Widows. People that are really making a difference in the industry, people that are making a difference all over. Some incredibly new staff. We filled out our new CFO position, Dennis Mahoney, a real industry financial wizard. Bob Sango-Dolch, a former CIO of eBay, is going to help us build our cyber museum down the road. And of course, the wonderful, committed people that are trustees, including Ned Feigenbaum, who is on our panel tonight, that I think you're all going to enjoy. On the collections front, we put we hired Al Casso, which many of you know from the community, is the Robert N. Miner Software Curator. It's really a new position, a museum position, that was named after the co-founder of Oracle, Bob Miner. And we're proud that really we're probably one of the few, if only, museum in the world that is devoting a substantial effort into the software preservation world, as well as the hardware and collectible world. As you know, or may not know, we've been collecting for over 30 years, and we probably have the largest collection of artifacts in the world. And we're very proud of that, and largely because of people like you that have helped find those things and put that here to preserve and present for posterity. And our international mission is something special in all of our side, because it's not just about Silicon Valley or California or the United States, it's about the world, just as the internet has changed the world. And that's what we are trying to preserve. All in all, we've done an incredible number of things. We've done a series of restorations this year, the PDP-1. How many people have ever used a PDP-1 in this room? Look at the number of people that have actually used it. Well, you can actually see it working. And we've had a terrific restoration team. How many people have used a 1401, an IBM 1401? My God, there's even more. I can't believe it. We have an incredible number of people that have been working as volunteers and have put a whole restoration project together. And then over the course of probably 6 months, you're going to see that as a public display. Because we want to bring computing alive from the past, the present, and the future. And I think all of those things are happening here at the museum, and I'm very proud to be its leader here as CEO. Really, in addition, it's the people that really make the difference in the whole business, the people in this room. We've done an order of about 50 oral histories, which are really video histories, some of which go on 3 to 5 hours, believe it or not, because it gets so exciting for people. But for posterity, 50 years from now, when you look back, just think of the gems and jewels of things that we will actually learn about our own history as we live through it. And it's kind of hard to see what history is all about at such close distance, but it's something that's very important, I think, to have for our future. We also want to honor all the people in our Fellows Awards, which we had last October. And we're very happy that Bob Kahn is one of a museum fellow that we were inducted last fall. So with all the things that are happening, the public programs, the oral histories, the restoration, building a strong community, our future is also very bright and challenging with the enormous magnitude of things that we're trying to accomplish. In October 2009, we'll be opening our signature exhibit, The Timeline of Computing History, downstairs in about 14,000 square feet. In addition, simultaneously, and maybe before and or after, we'll have a cyber museum that'll open that'll really herald all the things that we think are going to be very important about computing history to share with people in this room and ourselves and the rest of the world. So join us Be a volunteer. Help support us as we go forward. Help us donate things that you think are important, because that's what it's all about in preserving our own heritage. And each and every one of you that I know as I look around this room are phenomenal people that each contributed in their own right to that particular goal. So let me now move toward tonight's event, because it's a very special evening for me. Both of these gentlemen I've known for many years, and they're very special people in my mind for not only the things they've accomplished, but their personal commitments and the friendships that they've given and motivation for myself. In my own career, from my ARPA days to working at NCSA and now here at the Computer History Museum, it's a real pleasure to stand before you. In addition, let me say a few words about Ed Feigenbaum, who I mentioned was a museum trustee, really a world-class computer scientist in the AI field. I'm not really sure how retired Ed really is or ever will become, but certainly he was a professor at Stanford University, and I think he continues to be so. He's co-director of the Knowledge Systems Laboratory at Stanford, and he's one of the founders of the field of expert systems and the author of several books and dozens of papers that have been widely influential in both technical and policy communities. He's the winner of the 1994 ACM Turing Award, the co-founder of 3 startup firms in applied artificial intelligence, and serves as chief scientist of the United States Air Force from 1994 to 1997. He received his doctorate at Carnegie Mellon University under AI pioneer and Nobel laureate Herb Simon. And of course, what I have to communicate is really the 2 people you see on stage this evening are the best of friends. So you're going to have a very special evening in conversation with the 2 of them. Bob Kahn is chairman, CEO, and president of the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, founded in 1986 after Bob served 13 years at the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. CNRI was created as a not-for-profit organization to provide leadership and funding for research and development for many things having to do with building the national infrastructure. In his recent work, Bob has been involved in a number of things above and beyond what we know him for, and that is one of the early founders and inventors of TCP/IP, as well as many other things along the way, which you'll hear about. But he also was interested in digital object architectures and really worked in many policy issues for the federal government and the world, for that matter, which I'm sure he'll talk about this evening. And besides his recent Museum Fellows Award, some of Bob's other significant awards include the AFIP's Harry Good Memorial Award, the Marconi Award, the President's Award for ACM, the IEEE Koji Kobayashi Computer Communications Award, the IEEE Third Millennium Medal, and the Computer World and Smithsonian Award. He received twice the Secretary of Defense Civilian Service Award, and in 2004, the AM Turing Award from ACM. And if that wasn't enough, Bob Kahn received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Lastly, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in May of 2006. Bob has got his BEE from City College of New York and MA and PhD degrees from Princeton University. And of course, the thing that's very important to me is I consider Bob one of my good friends and certainly wonderful people that you're going to hear about this evening. So please welcome Ed Feigenbaum and Bob Kahn. Thank you.
So I get to do the first few minutes, and then Bob does the rest. I want to say that I think we're going to have a really, really special evening. Bob is a really special person. When Bob and I began to communicate about this, we talked about the kinds of stories and history that we would discuss, and I'm going to quote from Bob. Why did I do what I did? What were the circumstances of the jobs like? What issues did I have to confront? And so on, unquote. So tonight is Bob's night, not Ed's night. You're going to hear Bob's stories. We're going to be able to explore Bob, the scientist and technologist. He's one of the greatest of our generation. Bob, the government administrator of extraordinary energy, creativity, and influence. We wouldn't have what we have now if it weren't for Bob's skill as a government administrator. Bob as the creator of effective and important private sector institutions, for example, that manage the internet, or his current organization, CNRI. And most important of all, Bob the person, who is among the greatest and most gracious and interesting people you'll ever meet. Finally, I'd just like to say one word about the government service that Bob did. I have, since having served in Washington for a while, I came to have a perspective on what I call the greatest public servants of the generation. And there are a few, Bill Perry being an example of one of them. Well, Bob is one of the greatest public servants of our generation. And I think we ought to think about that and focus our attention on his service to the United States. So tonight we're going to do some stories. Now, I said this is going to be all about Bob, but sorry, I have to start with an Ed story. Ed gets into retirement and thinks that, well, he's led a great life, and why doesn't he write it down, and it's going to become a bestseller, and then it'll be bought up by the movies, and Robert Redford will play Ed. And so I took this idea down to, but, you know, what do I know about writing stories? I had gotten intrigued by stories. Bran Farren had given us all a lecture at the 97 ACM 50th anniversary. Remember that, where he said, the trouble with you guys is you're not storytellers? And I took him seriously, and then I read things that Roger Schenck has written about the centrality of storytelling and story memory in human intelligence. Wonderful book called Tell Me a Story by Roger Schenck. So I thought, well, I better consult with a professional story writer. So I happened to have a contact in Hollywood, and I went down and talked to a professional person who makes up storyboards for the movies. And he said, talk to me a little bit about your career. So I did. And he said, oh, I see. Well, you have the ultimate story. The ultimate story is The Quest. And you were on a quest. Now, in a quest story, which is the most popular of all story modes, whether there are 5 stories in the world or 32 or 160 or something like that, is all written out in books that story writers use. But anyway, the quest always comes up to be the number 1 story. When you're in a quest story, said this Hollywood guy to me, you have to have your ups, and then you have your downs, and then you have a higher up, and then you have a higher down, and finally you reach your quest. And he said, tell me about those. And I said, well, but I don't have any downs. It's all been up. It's been up for a while, and then it got better, and it got better after that, and it got better after that, and it's all up. And he looks at me and says, Ed, you don't have a story. So I hope tonight that Bob will tell us his quests, his ups and his downs. Because on the surface of it, it looks like Bob, it's been all up, right? I mean, we all know Bob. What are the stories? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Bob's early history at MIT and then at BBN and the Arpanet. And then comes this great story, the sort of the Thomas Edison story. I always call him my Thomas Edison. The interneting story, followed by a great government plan, a great government program called the Strategic Computing Program. Then Bob left the government, and there's a whole set of stories involving his new organization, CNRI, which we won't have time to cover all of them, but I hope to cover some juicy ones. And finally, we'll sort of wrap it up with an overview, kind of perspective on all of these different things that Bob has done. There's not nearly enough time to cover them all. We'll try to do the best we can. We're going to stop in about an hour and open the floor for questions from the audience so that you can raise any issues that are on your mind. So Bob sent me some notes about his life. Most of the things I knew, but some of them I didn't. And here's one that I didn't know, and it just jumped right out at me off the page. In fact, as I was reading it, I went to the highlighter and highlighted it in red. Bob got his PhD in 1964 from a small eastern college called Princeton, and then went to work for another small eastern college called MIT. 1964. And this is what appears in Bob's notes. He took a leave of absence from MIT in October of 1966 to work at BB&N. Now, if you're a professor, you know that that is a remarkably stupid thing to do. When you're trying to get tenure, to take a leave of absence right after you get the job. I mean, MIT must have been going crazy. So there must be a story there, right? Bob, what's the story?
Well, first of all, I want to say there are a lot of my friends in the audience here, and probably including some that knew me back then, so some of them may relate to it very personally. But I had started my career out at Bell Laboratories, and then I went back and got a doctoral degree at Princeton in electrical engineering, but it was really more applied mathematics than it was, circuits and the like. A lot of physics, a lot of math. And when I graduated, I took a faculty position at MIT. I was actually fairly fortunate to get it because I applied late and all the positions were filled. But when I did join the faculty, I was sort of viewed as an applied mathematician. I think that's the way it was. And there were a lot of very good people there. Claude Shannon was on the faculty. Many people may know him from his early work at Bell Labs and then in information theory. And they had many other really good mathematicians from the faculty. The fellow who ran the group was a gentleman named Jack Wozencraft. Many of you may know him. He wrote one of the classic books in communication along with Irwin Jacobs, who is now the chairman of Qualcomm. And I was very energetic in the kind of problems I would deal with. And every now and then his door was always open. I could always walk in. And I'd sit down and try and get him to engage me with a problem. And I would say 3 out of 4 times, maybe even 4 out of 5, he would continue doing what he was doing, and I kind of felt like, he's not telling me to leave, but I felt like I was interrupting what he was doing. And 1 out of 5 times, he'd get up, really energized, get up on the board and, work with me on the problem. And finally, I screwed up my courage, and I just asked him, I said, why is it that this happens? And he says, when you are working on a problem that I know what to do with the answer to, he says, I can get very interested. He says, but if it's a problem, he says, all your problems are interesting mathematically, but if I don't know what to do with the answer, he says, it's hard for me to get motivated. And I said, well, but how can you tell? Because to me, they were all interesting problems. So he said, well, that's experience. He says, if you've been involved in building things and the like, he says, you'll know. I said, well, how do you get that experience? He says, well, sort of gratuitous comment on his part, I think, but he said, if I were you, I take a year or 2, go apprentice yourself, go work with somebody who knows how to make things happen, and then come on back. And it was a few weeks later, I was out the door, and I think he was honestly serious because, they tried many, many times to get me to then come back, and that's another whole story. But there were 2 places I was looking at very closely at the time. One was Lincoln Labs, which was clearly in the area, run by MIT, and the other was an architectural acoustics firm called Beranek and Newman. I saw Bert Sutherland early on. Bert was one of the people I worked with very closely there. In fact, Bert was my boss for a while at BB&N. I ended up deciding to go to BB&N, and the person who made the sale for me to go there, actually convinced me to do that, was a fellow named Jordan Baruch. Jordan, many of you may know, was one of the founders of BB&N. I don't think he had his name on the storyboard there, but he later had a role in Washington. He was one of the assistant secretaries of commerce, and he convinced me to come. But when I showed up there, just before I got there, he actually left to go run a startup providing time-sharing services to Mass General Hospital. And so I ended up in a group that was run by a fellow named Jerry Elkind, who was actually only there for a short period of time before he ended up going to MIT, and then I think he went out to Park for a while, maybe a long time. So I ended up going to BB&N and just deciding to cut my teeth on some real problem. And the problem I chose to work on was networking. This was a time when this was not de rigueur. This was not a topic that people were rushing into. And in fact, I gave one of the commencement talks at one of the universities on the East Coast, and I said, you know, most of the people in my field thought at the time that this was a bet your career kind of move, that, you know, it wasn't viewed as a good thing to go into. We were dealing with a world back in the mid-1960s when this happened where there were very few time-sharing systems around. People were mostly relying on batch machines. The universities had a lot of computing centers. It just didn't seem like a very fruitful area to go into. And what did I know? I mean, what do you do when every senior person in your field is telling you you're making a mistake? There's no there. I did what I do anyway. I just trust my internal instincts and said, well, that's what interests me. That's what I'm going to do. And I think there's a real message there, because most people who really do well at some new thing, if it was obvious to everybody else, other people would have been doing it a long time before. So for me, it was something that I didn't know I was doing, but it was so instinctive. I just said, that's what I'm interested in. That's what I was working on. And there I was, writing memos on different parts of networking, you know, buffer control, flow control, congestion control, routing. And to me, that was getting your hands dirty, is writing these memos. I mean, I had not yet discovered the fact that you could actually build something. And I had a whole raft of them, and then all of a sudden, I think it was Jerry Elkind came to me and said, you know, there's an organization in Washington. I had heard of them, but I didn't know anybody there. But they were funding some work there and at MIT and elsewhere called ARPA. It's before the D was on front of the name. And I said, you know, you really ought to share some of that stuff with them. I think they'd be interested. So I said, fine. And he then later shared with me that they were planning to actually create a net, and they thought that this might help. So I did. And I remember mailing those things to some combination of Bob Taylor and Larry Roberts, who were both at DARPA at the time. And then I got a call back from, I think it was Bob Taylor, who said, could you show up and, you know, come down to DARPA and come visit? And I did. I spent time with Bob and with Larry and, you know, just sort of explaining what some of those ideas were. And it suddenly dawned on me that somebody might actually build a network at that point in time. I still wasn't thinking that I would be involved in it at all. I mean, it hadn't yet dawned on me. I was still the applied mathematician from Bell Labs who was planning to go back to MIT. Well, meanwhile, MIT was, you know, pushing on me. You know, they wanted either their slot back or, you know, come back and get on the faculty. And suddenly this RFQ shows up out of DARPA to go build a network, and it shows up on my desk. Somehow it got routed to me. And
How old were you at that time?
So this would have been 1967, so I would have been probably 28 or so. I took a look at the thing, and, you know, I said, gee, that's pretty amazing. Somebody's going to build this. Still didn't realize that I would have a role in it. There was another fellow at BB&N by the name of Frank Hart. Bert would probably remember him pretty well. It's not a fellow you easily forget. Frank shows up in my office one day, and he says, I understand that you have a copy of this RFQ. Can I see it? And I said, who are you? So he explains who he is. He had just come to BB&N from Lincoln Lab. I was actually, I believe, the first person that BB&N hired in the communications field. They were pretty much an architectural acoustics field by background, and they had gotten into computing in the early 60s. And they had some very good computing people there. But I was the only communications person that was there at the time. Frank was a kind of a real-time systems builder, and he had a group of people that worked with him. And I said, well, here it is, take a look at it. But it was not easy to figure out how to go from the document to actually building something. It was sort of like, you can know a lot about putting screw threads on pipes. It's a different thing to create a nuclear reactor. You have to know about other things. And so he asked me if I would work with him if he wanted to put in a bid on it. And I said, yeah, happy to help you. What I didn't understand at the time was the internal politics of BB&N, which were fairly complicated. And I don't plan to go into them in gory detail here, but
give us 2 minutes worth.
2 minutes worth. Jerry Elkind came to me one day. I had been working on creating a simulation system, and I had worked with a fellow named Warren Titleman. I don't know if Warren's in the audience here, but Warren was a Lisp expert. This was before the inner Lisp stuff, or before Common Lisp. With BB&N had their own version of BB&N Lisp. And Warren, and I wasn't really a computer programmer, but I was sort of a good conceptualizer and good architect. And so Warren and I sat down together, and he figured out how to make this BB&N Lisp system produce interactive graphic displays before, we were working off, for the most part, Model 33 teletypes back then. And he actually built a really neat display system. So you could sit down and you could program different things and watch the packets move around and calculate measurements and program routing algorithms and the like. And that's what I thought was getting your fingers dirty. So one day, I go to Jerry and talking about how I should charge my time, and he said, well, all the money, and we had actually written a proposal to build the Arpanet. I actually wrote the technical part of the proposal. We sent it in, and it was a very important learning experience for me. I actually learned how to build things sort of in real time. I had Severo Warnstein working with me. Severo was a world-class hardware guy, people who know him. And he'd say, well, what does the interface have to do? And I'd describe it, and he'd be designing the flip-flops in real time from words out of my mouth. And that's how I sort of got to know how to do that. So we sent in the proposal, and we got selected. And Jerry came to me one day, and he said, well, if you want to charge, he says, you'll have to get the money from Frank. He's got the money. Well, Frank had this notion that if you were going to get money from him, he wanted you to be working right there with him and his group. So I picked myself up and I moved into his group, which was in another building. Just picked up one day and moved over there and started to work on, the networking side of things. Turned out that was not a move I really wanted to make, but I didn't seem to have any choice at the time, because it was either do that and be funded or not. And so that's what I did. And I ended up sort of masterminding the system design of the network. Well, there were other people building it at the time. I mean, Bill Crowther got hired to go write the software, and Severo was building the hardware, and I was sort of conceptualizing it. And we had one really fundamental problem, and it sort of drove everything for, I would say, the next several years. And that was a philosophical issue. Conceptually, when I was looking at the net, I was saying, with all these packets flowing around, what would you do if you got into a kind of a, what the Boston box is? It's where, you get four cars in the intersection, and car 1 can't go because car 2 is blocking it, and car can't go because car 3 is blocking it. And I said, I think that could happen in the net. And I think virtually everybody in that group, from Frank on down, said that was crazy. Never going to happen. It's sort of like worrying about all the oxygen molecules showing in the upper right-hand corner of the room and everybody all suffocating. Not going to happen. So I said, yeah, but I'm worried about that. And I had designed all these algorithms for deal with it, detecting, relieving congestion and all the like. The system didn't get built that way. And so I got assigned to do the first testing of the Arpanet out in California at UCLA. And the first thing I did was to go show that this system could lock up. And we locked it up in 12 packets. Dave Walden and I went out there. Dave was sort of doing whatever he had to do to run the test programs and the like. And so we got the thing locked up, kind of had all the notes on it. We went back and reported to the guys that, this algorithm that we were running in the net isn't going to work because the whole thing is going to potentially lock up. Nobody wanted to hear it. About 4 months later, Bill Crowther went off and wrote a little simulation. It must have stuck in his craw that there was an issue here. And he went back to Frank and reported that there's a problem with the thing. It could really lock up. And Frank came to me and was all angry. He says, how come you didn't tell us about this? Now, I'm reminded of the case of the admirals on a big ship, and somebody says, there's a hole in, what would happen if you had a hole in the left side of the ship? And he says, don't bother with me, I'm busy. Meanwhile, there's a hole in the left side of the ship. So we ended up spending the next year and a half just sort of rewriting the code to make it all work well. And once we got it worked well, I then moved back into the research group, and that's when Bert, who received me at that point, probably remembers that very well. And then I spent the next year of my life doing the first public demonstration of the Arpanet, which was in Washington.
Bob, from my point of view, that was a really big deal, getting that show on the road. That was a really big impact event. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, it was at the Washington Hilton. It was literally the week before I joined DARPA. We had like 40 different terminals, and we put an imp in the middle of the Washington Hilton ballroom. And for a week in 1972, we had virtually everybody who was anybody in networking converged into that one, and people wouldn't leave. I mean, it was like a night and day experience. And it was one of the most profound moments, I think, in the history of networking. We had a little of everything. We had, SRI demonstrating its NLS system there, and we had, BB&N doing the graphic stuff, moving things back and forth, and just about everybody who was playing in the network world was there at that time. It was just a major event. But it was not that easy to set up because, I remember going around and talking to the different parties. And one group I talked to was GE, which ran, at the time, I think it was GE Information Systems. And I remember talking to the senior VP who ran it, and he said, look, what you're trying to do here with this network and all this interoperability, he says, not in most companies' best interest. He says, if you'd like, he says, we'll give you all the terminals and we'll put it in and we'll showcase our system. I said, that's not what this is about. This is about interoperability and interactions. And so we ended up making that happen. I remember we had, a staff. The guy who did all the scripting was a fellow named Bob Metcalf. I probably know from 3Com days. Bob wrote all the scenarios in his nice big type. We had John Postel walking up and down the halls, making sure people understood how the protocols were working. I had Vince Cerf walking up, and down the aisles helping when he had his nice black beard and still had some hair. So it was an all-star cast that we had, and it was a great event. I think it put networking on the map. I still have some of the slides for that. I ought to give them to John to put here, and I have some audio from interviewing people. What do you think about networking from those days? And there's actually a film that we made that we presented there, which I'm going to put a little leader on because DARPA is having a 40th anniversary, or is it the 50th? I guess it's the 50th anniversary coming up, and we're going to sort of put that video, which is a kind of a who's who of the field back then, discussions with Licklider and others about networking, and just sort of put it in context. But it was a great time, and it was a lot of fun doing that, and I got a lot of support from Bert to do that at the time. So those were good days.
Bob, let me, if you don't mind, switch to story number 2, which sort of begins around here, which is the interneting story. Big deal, changes our world. Starts out not as the internet, but as interneting, which is your word. Tell us about that, how you began working on this with Vint, what the problems were, what the issues were. You were mentioning, for example, that it's not in corporate interest to replace their big fat microwave towers with packets and all that. Well,
Even at the level of just computer networking, most of the universities were interested in having their comp centers be available to other parties. They were worried about losing business and the like.
So also tell us about the battle for the internet name.
That's a long story. And that eventually, focuses around my wife Patrice, who's sitting on the front row right next to John over there. That I'll come back to that, but that was a 10-year battle to protect the name Internet. We spent probably close to $1 million on doing that. We teamed with the Internet Society to help doing that, but we put up most of the money. And eventually the name prevailed, but we could have easily lost the Internet in that process. My one regret is I didn't get more industrial support to do that, but I mean, that's one of the services that we did out of CNRI. And I think it was really essential to preserving the internet as we know it today. It's still pretty fragile, but I'll come back to that.
Okay.
I joined ARPA in late October of 1972. I actually had one of the longest tenures there of anybody. And maybe if you look at it from a technical perspective, it could have been the longest one, and certainly in the computer part of DARPA. And when I got there, Larry Roberts had hired me to go work on automated manufacturing. Little known fact, I was anxious to move away from networking for a whole bunch of reasons that I won't go into, but automated manufacturing really appealed to me because it was, I mean, I was now fulfilling this charter that Jack Wozencraft had laid out to get into doing some things real, get some real experience. You'll note that I was not en route back to MIT at this point. I mean, the decision to go to DARPA was not an easy one. Larry had asked me to go to DARPA something like April or May of 1971, but we were still not finished doing what I needed to at BB&N, so I actually didn't agree to do that until, I would say, June of 1972. It was literally a year before I agreed to do that. At that point in time, we had some people from BB&N that had gone out to try and put packet networking on the map. This fellow named Lee Talbert had started the very first company called Packet Communications, Inc. Of course, BB&N followed real time with a company of their own called Telenet. Steve Levy was the first president, and they hired Larry out of DARPA to become the second president of Telenet. And Telenet actually had some modest success. It was not anything like the Arpanet at that point in time, because it was more commercial. They were trying to make money as opposed to just demonstrating something for the research community. And I'll never forget, a little sidebar story here. At one meeting, I was talking about how the commercial nets really didn't allow you to do computer-to-computer interaction. And I remember Alex Roth, who was then running the Washington AFIPS office, got up and challenged me on the floor. He said, "Bob, that's just not right." He says, "I know that's not right because I log into Telenet every day and I move stuff between computers." And I said, "Really? Tell me about that." He says, "Well, I have an account on a BB&N machine, and I also have an account on a machine at USC, the ECL machine." And he says, "Every day I go in and I, back up my stuff, move things back and forth." And I said, "Do you know how the information moves between machines?" He says, "Yeah, I go onto Telenet, I move it through Telenet." I said, "Actually, you don't, because both of those machines are also on the Arpanet. And they're using all these Arpanet protocols to move it. So when you think you're doing it on the commercial net, you're actually doing it through the internet with these background moves." Didn't realize that, but so anyway, Larry left ARPA, and I did not follow through on this automated manufacturing job because the Congress killed the program shortly after I got there. It was a big deal. It was going to focus on artificial intelligence in the factories, and it just seemed like a really neat new thing to go work on. You would have appreciated that back then. So then the question was what to do, and I was strongly debating whether to go back and just go back to the faculty. And Larry said, "Look, you know a lot about networking." I think he actually said, "You know more than anybody about networking," but I don't have the exact words handy. But he said, "You can't just stop, and you got to continue on." And he had started a number of other things there, one of which was a packet satellite program. It's interesting because the way he was proceeding with that program, he had funded BB&N to take an Arpanet IMP and put some satellite code in there and run it over satellite to another IMP in Europe, which would have made the satellite net essentially be a modem between two IMPs. And so I decided to stick around and sort of get more involved. First thing I did was I started up a program in packet radio. Now, Larry had been thinking about that, but it really hadn't gotten launched. And so I started that program. We got it launched. We worked with a number of people in this area, including SRI, which was one of the main fielders of that system. I see Don Nielsen there. Don was very involved in that. In fact, one of the most interesting stories I ever encountered was in doing one of the tests of the packet radio program. We had tried to get spectrum to show that this radio system, which was a spread spectrum system, a forerunner of today's CDMA technologies, would run in crowded bands. And I remember writing a letter to the military group that controlled spectrum. It's called IRAC, the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee, and I asked them for a heavily loaded band. He wrote back saying they didn't have any. I said, no, that can't be. So I'll take a lightly loaded band. I don't have any of those either. So we finally negotiated the 1400 to 1500 megahertz band to build some test equipment. I wanted to see, what the interference levels were. And so they gave us that band, and you go through a two-step process. First you get an allocation, then you get an assignment when you are ready to go. So we built the equipment. We spent several $1 million, and we were ready to do the testing. And then I asked for an assignment, and they said, "Oh my God, that's the band in which all the en route air traffic control radars work." And we were going to do the testing here. SRI was going to do the testing, and so we had it carefully designed, and we ended up. What the plan was, we put some antennas on, I don't know the logistics here exactly, but I think it was Scarper Peak. Is there such a place like that out here? And I was going to be up at Mount Tamalpais. It was an Air Force radar station up there, and we were going to watch the blips on the radar screens and see how things were going. And we had people in the en route air traffic control centers, and the FAA was beside themselves. You're going to interfere with our planes landing at San Francisco Airport. We said, no, the whole point is to show it won't interfere. And so we worked this out ahead of time. I was up in Mount Tamalpais. We ran the experiments, and we basically showed that there was no interference in all the normal levels. We actually had a horn antenna at one point just aiming down the throat of the radar system. And we cranked the power up on it, little by little with a 20 dB gain antenna. Finally, we got to the point where they could see it, and the agreement with them was the minute the guys in the radar station there said stop, so we were all outfitted with walkie-talkies, independent systems, and we just shut it down, and that was that. Well, up in Mount Tamalpais, they had like 2 feet of snow while I was up there. It made it kind of hard to get up and get back down. I remember calling my dad from up there. They had a payphone, and I said, I'm in San Francisco. What's it like out there? He says, well, they got 2 feet of snow out here. He says, they've never had 2 feet of snow in San Francisco. So I explained what was happening. This was a fun time. So we ended up building a packet radio system, sort of like an Arpanet, except all the nodes were mobile and they were sort of broadcast radio. And we built the system on Intelsat 4, which is the packet satellite system. I was now becoming a real system designer. Sort of my life was unalterably changed at that point, by that point in time. And the internet really came about from the intent on my part to sort of show that those systems could all work together, and that machines on any one could work with machines on the other. That was the goal. But before I finish up on that story, let me tell you a little bit about the satellite part of it. The way that the satellite net was being implemented by BB&N, it was literally a modem connection through the satellite. And I looked at that and I said, that doesn't help with the objective of showing how you can make different networks connect together. Xerox PARC was working on the Ethernet at that time. We knew that was likely to be yet a fourth net that was around. And so what I needed to do was to get a clean separation between the satellite net and the Arpanet so we could show how to go put them together. And of course, the notion that I had back then was the thing that would go in between was called a gateway. Now you know it by the name router, but that was basically a router. It would process internet packets and, basically handle all the routing. Well, BB&N was not interested at all in this, because if we were now going to split it out, it simply meant that, they had all the technical arguments on their side. On the one hand, if you split it out and you had an Arpanet IMP and then a gateway and then a satellite box, you had 3 boxes rather than 1. You had 3 times the delay. You had 3 points of failure. Technically, they were right. You would be better off putting them together, but the total control of the interface between them was a software interface between the lower 16K of memory and the upper 16K. My view was, let's split them apart. Well, I wasn't getting much traction with the group that was building that because it was probably a loss of control. So I talked to the BBNN management, and we got agreement that we would give another part of BBNN the job of building the gateway in between. And that was, I guess that was probably Division 4 back then, and Division 6 was doing the others. And now BBNN had the responsibility for making the whole thing work. If it was some other group external to BBNN that had to build the thing in the middle, you could easily imagine how the set of things putting together wouldn't work. So that was actually the hardest single task technically in making the internet happen, was causing that split to occur. And it was quite an internal struggle that we had in making that happen.
Can we count that as one of your struggles in the quest?
That was a struggle. I mean, for a long time, I wasn't sure it was going to work. I wasn't sure we were going to.
All up?
But let me tell you the even harder part. You know, you might think it was a no-brainer to go and get funding for the internet. The internet program could not be sold at DARPA in the early days. I had no success. And the reason makes sense if you understand how DARPA works. I mean, DARPA is looking for a military partner, they're looking for tech transfer, they're looking for possible funding, they're looking for a plan to get stuff built that will help the DoD. That's their mission in life. Now, it's true that much of what the office that I ended up running was funding was basic research, and in fact, you probably remember how much pushback we got when we were doing some of the command and control test bed stuff, because it was more applications than not. But that's what was required. So here's a time when the DoD had no time-sharing computers. In fact, they had very few computers of their own, and the ones that they did have were used in the back office for things like accounting and maybe a few strategic things out at places like Offutt Air Force Base. But for the most part, they didn't have computers, and therefore they didn't have any need for networks to connect those computers. And if they had, they were mainly batch machines, which wouldn't have worked on the networks anyway. And therefore, they certainly didn't need to be involved in a program to connect the networks they didn't have to the computers that they didn't have. So that was the sale, and it didn't go anywhere. Fortunately, we were able to make the case for the packet radio net. Packet radio net was clearly something you could see used in, an Army situation, in airplanes, ships at sea, wherever. And in fact, it was taken over, I think, used in Desert Storm as an actual technology. But we just couldn't make that case. So now the bottom line was, with the packet radio program, we were dealing with a time frame when the only computers we had were big time-sharing systems. You couldn't carry them around with you. I mean, you could barely carry these packet radios. They were like a cubic foot. They weighed 70 pounds. I call them luggable. I mean, you wouldn't put them in your shirt pocket. And today's dollars, they probably cost $300,000. So these were big items. And so we needed to get to the Arpanet to get to the computing stuff. And so we did all of the work on interneting as a subpart of the packet radio program, until we could show that it worked, and at which point then it became possible to argue for it on its own merits because people could see the value of it. The Ethernets were starting to come out, and at that point it was possible to sell it as a program, but you couldn't make that case up front.
Bob, I wanted to ask you about other aspects of the role of the DoD in the shaping of the Internet, like the security issue and so on.
Yeah.
What can you say about that?
Well, so let me tell you how the framing of the problem came up first, and then I'll get into that. So here we were with these three nets about to happen, and I clearly had an architecture in my head about how to put these things together. You have to remember, I came out of the communication side of the world. I was not really a card-carrying computer scientist at that point in time. I was not part of the Project Mac activity at MIT. I came out of the RLE side of the world. My background from Bell Labs, I was more of a communications person than I was a computer person. And yet I knew that to make this architecture work, we needed to get protocols embedded in the different operating systems. I knew that was necessary. Bob Metcalf in his PhD thesis referenced a paper that I wrote at BBNN, which I think has been probably lost in antiquity by now, would that we had digital libraries. It was a basic look at turning basically computers into communicating devices, so that instead of treating the Arpanet as we did in the early days from the protocol perspective as kind of like a line printer, something you attach to a computer and it just got the bits somewhere, that the computer would be part of the communications process. So if something got lost, it could be retransmitted, it could do error checking, all the things that a communications protocol would do. And so I pretty much had an idea of what the architecture would be, but I didn't know exactly how to get it embedded in the machines. And that's where I invited Vint to come work with me on that. Vint was at Stanford at the time, and he had been involved in the original protocol development for the Arpanet. And it was not a very interesting protocol. In fact, it treated the net, really, as I said before, like a line printer. If something didn't show up, it was broken, you press the reset button and start it all over. Well, in a world of multiple nets, that doesn't go anywhere, because routers can lose things, or radio net could get interference, and there are all kinds of reasons why packets get lost, especially if you go through a tunnel, behind a mountain, whatever. And so we were looking for, some way to make that, that viable. Vint knew a lot about that, and so I invited him to come work with me on that. And he actually added quite a bit to the development of that whole thing. He had some interesting ideas, and I think by virtue of that collaboration, we actually ended up with something that was better, stronger, more robust than I could have done on my own. I don't think he would have started that effort either, because I think he was coming at it from a totally different space. But we collaborated for many, many years. In fact, when I started CNRI later, Vint became employee number 2. And I worked with him closely for, probably by now he's maybe spent more time working with other organizations, but up until now, mainly with me. So that's sort of how that happened. So we started working together, and it was really a research operation. We were trying to figure out, how do you make these nets work together? How do you get the computers to work together? We weren't trying to build something that was workable when we started, because we didn't know how to do it, but here we had the satellite net that went to Europe on Intelsat 4. We had links into Germany, into Italy, into Norway, into England, and of course with the US. And we had the whole Arpanet activity. We had a few packet radio nets around the country. And so suddenly we had the base of something, but then the Ethernet sprang up. And there were a lot of other kind of nets. I mean, there were 3 or 4 or 5 different types of nets that sprung up. But even that probably would have gotten nowhere if we hadn't then had the workstation activity happen. Because people just didn't have, it wasn't, the whole personal computer revolution was about to happen, and that gets into the strategic computing part of the story. So there were many early activities on building personal computers of one sort or another. You can probably remember all the names. In fact, one of the premier ones happened right here in this area with the Sun Workstation that came out of the Stanford University Network project that Forrest Baskett started. I had a major role in helping Forrest get started with that project. But back in the early days when we were doing the internet, there was no way that we could have gotten security into that system. I think just getting security on the Arpanet was a sufficiently hard problem. I mean, imagine trying to convince somebody in the security business that you needed a bypass around their crypto device, because you needed to be able to tell the packets where to go. Well, bypasses around crypto devices were not looked at with very much favor in the security community. And so finally we built the very first device, and the first device was called a private line interface. It involved a processor that, talked to one of the, I think it was a KG34 encryption device, and another processor on the other side. So the only way the 2 processors could communicate was through this crypto box. So everything came through encrypted. So you had to pre-program the network side with a particular network address, and therefore all the packets would go there. It would essentially turn the Arpanet, as it were originally, into a private wire. And then we had some more discussions, and the suggestion was put on the table, well, what if we allowed for 5 bits of bypass? And we didn't allow you to wiggle those bits very often. Now, was that a security violation? Lord knows, but the powers that be finally said, we will bless that and allow it to be used for secure stuff. And so that was the first addressable system. With 5 bits, you could address it to one of 32 destinations. When we got to the internet, we actually built internet versions of those kind of things. But ultimately, it got absorbed within the regular DoD establishment. They took it on in a serious way. I see Frank Kuo was here. Frank spent a lot of time on those kind of issues. I think that the security aspects of networking are not just technical. They are absolutely policy issues, in part they're political issues, and they get tightly tied up in needs of law enforcement, intelligence, and the like. So it's not, when people say, there's a problem with the internet today because it doesn't have security, it's not like you need a whole new net in order to put security. You need to work the establishment side of it to understand how to deal with it. If you're going to put trust into a system, how do you do that? There are probably people in this room who have some pretty good ideas about how to do that. But, there are a variety of ways that you can do it. There are a lot of interesting ideas in networking that ought to be explored that are not part of the current net, and that's a whole other story. But it's probably not the things that people would traditionally point their finger at and say we need a new net because of security or because we have viruses or because we have, spam.
Bob, question about the acceptance of the internet. It's like you were from the communication side, I was from the computer science side, so I didn't pay too much attention to what was going on.
Yeah, we were just doing the wiring.
But, right, the plumbers.
The plumbing.
You guys were the plumbers.
Right.
But there was a big battle going on which somehow resolved itself in what we now call the internet between other kinds of protocols. Other people had their ideas. There were some European things, and there was big fights going on. And what happened what was that story all about? And how did you get the internet protocols in place?
Well, I'll tell you, I believe that longevity in that job was pretty critical to what happened. And not only that, but I think if I hadn't set up CNRI and we hadn't taken on the responsibility for managing the standards process, the internet as we know it today probably would not have happened. Today, if you go into government service, there's a very rapid turnaround. People don't stay very long. It's very hard to make something of this kind of proportion happen when you're only there for a year or two or three. I mean, it could take you a year to justify a program, get it on the books. It might be another year before the funding and contracts are in place, and by then you're on the way out. And this required a really long-term commitment to make happen. The world was pretty well established in terms of how to handle communications. There were UN structures that were dealing with world kinds of issues, the ITU, and some of its predecessors, the CCITT, were all out there. There was a European organization called CEPT. It stood for the Commission of European PTTs. I always used to call it the Committee to Eliminate Progress in Telecommunications. But I won't tell you why.
Those were the Europeans I was referring to.
So the world had pretty much committed to using international protocols. And they were all the ISO protocols and the lower level stuff that, the X25 protocols and the like. This was the commitment, and everybody was committed to doing that, including the U.S. government. The problem was that that whole field was being done sort of top down. They'd figure out what the protocols were, they'd write the specs, they'd get people to buy in, and then they'd start implementing. But what we had done with the internet was built it. That is, we had put it out in place. We had a community of users. They were getting more users. Part of the story is an NSF story, what they did to help broaden out the community. But, by the time the world was trying to figure out how to make the ISO protocols take hold, everybody in the world who was anybody in making use of networks was already using the internet protocols, because we had sort of incrementally grown it and supported it and nurtured it and funded it over years and years and years. And there was no room for something else to take hold. These weeds had grown up everywhere, as many people thought. So,
well, that's the way it appeared to us. So the question is, how did you do it? How did you make it happen?
Well, I'm not sure that it was as carefully orchestrated as you'd like to think. It was orchestrated to a certain extent. And the largest part of it, I think, and part of the story that's least understood is the creation of the social institutions was probably key to it. Back in the late 70s, after Vint had joined me at DARPA, I remember going to him one day and saying, look, Vin, I was running this for a while, now you're running it. He was in the office. And I said, if something happens to the two of us, there's nobody left. And if worse yet, if something happens to you, I've got the problem, the monkey on my back. And I ended up getting it when he left back in 1982. But we need to figure out what to do with that. And so I suggested he set up a kitchen cabinet. Well, I didn't like that idea very much. But, if you wanted to get on the Internet back in the late 70s, remember, this was all an experimental system. I mean, there were no official protocols. The Internet protocols didn't become official until 1983. I actually managed that transition. People think it happened on January 1st of 83, but it was actually a long process. You can't change lots of machines and get everything moved from one to another and do it in zero time. But in 1978, Vint was, reluctant to do that. But he had another idea, which was that it was so hard for people to figure out how to get on the Internet. I mean, you had to roll your own. You wanted to get a gateway. You bought an LSI 11 from DEC, and you went to somebody and you bought some, maybe BB&N, you got some routing software and put it on, and you got the TCP/IP code, and you installed it on your computer, and then you had to figure out how to get all your applications hitched in. I mean, you just didn't get a turnkey thing that was the Internet box that you plugged on into your system. It was hard. So he set up something called the Internet Configuration Control Board that had sort of, I think, maybe 12 good implementers, all friends of ours. And those folks were then brought into the mix of sort of understanding what the Internet was about. And so we would, bat our ideas against them, tell them what we were up to, sort of got them up to speed.
What was the name of that group?
It was called the Internet Configuration Control Board, ICCB. And that really was sort of the start of the whole Internet process. And that process lasted until the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, it became very clear that we needed something that was more structural. Vint was there until 1982. He was there about 6 years. Left from Stanford, came to DARPA, and then left. And after he left, I took over running the program again. I actually managed the whole transition to the Internet protocols, and we ended up setting up a whole other architectural structure, something called the Internet Activities Board got set up. Later, the IETF got set up. We set up a whole standards process to manage that whole activity, and it was, a very interesting time frame.
Just to follow up, sorry to jump over our strategic computing program. We skipped running late, but I do want to ask you about
do we have any hard deadlines here to finish?
So, for our friends in the audience, one day I showed up at Bob's office. And some really tough things were going on. Bob was not smiling like he normally does, and Al Vesa was there, and he wasn't smiling like he normally does, and they were really tensed out about some event going on with the international community. Could you tell us what the story is behind that and how that resolved itself? And the whole thing about the international community wanting to take over the Internet and their frustrations with the United States and blah, 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 whatever it is.
Well, this is a long story.
Can you want, in any way you can tell it in 3 minutes?
No. Let's see. Do we really have to quit this at 8 o'clock?
I don't know. Maybe does anyone care about this story?
Well, all right. So here's what happened. The world discovered the Internet. In so doing, they really wanted to play a more central role. There were a number of things that happened along the way, but let me fast forward to 2003. There was a meeting that was held in Geneva. It was a World Summit on the Information Society, and the whole goal was that the nations of the world really needed to take over running the Internet. The United States had been responsible for it really since day one. I mean, from 1972, when I started the program, until roughly 1983, it was all run as part of a research operation. 1983, effectively between roughly January 1 and June 30th, that period, we transitioned over to the Internet protocols. We ran Arpanet protocols and Internet protocols for a while, but at this point in time, we had lots of Ethernets on the net, a lot of local area nets. We had moved into the personal computing arena. Sun Microsystems played a major role in that. Eventually, the IBM systems came on board. The TCP/IP protocols became de rigueur. They became the standards. So here we were, and the world community had really decided they needed to take over, running the internet. And so this first World Summit had been set up with that goal in mind. They didn't like the idea that the United States was continuing to run the internet, even though we had run it, for that whole period. In 1983, we kind of moved into a different mode. Eventually, NSF took over, became proprietors. They started with the NSF net. The ARPANET phased out, but the internet continued to grow. The IETF, which we started, and which CNRI actually ran until 1997. Then I set up a subsidiary to run it, and we ran that until 2005. This is really where the locus of all these efforts were taking place, but the world community really wanted to take it over. So the first World Summit was really set up with that goal in mind. And it didn't happen. I mean, it didn't happen that the world community took it over. And in fact, there was serious concern on the part of the United States that they really ought to turn it over to industry. I mean, I think that was the government position at the time. But when it became clear that that's not the way the rest of the governments of the world were looking at it necessarily, the United States chose not to let it go. They continued to maintain the oversight and control of that, mainly through an agreement that they had with an organization that got set up in 1998 called ICANN, which had responsibility for the oversight of the protocols. So they had this first World Summit in 2003 in Geneva, and it became very clear at that point in time that this wasn't a simple issue. This was not a matter of, get the United States out of it and have the foreign companies deal with it, but that there were a whole series of related issues that really needed to be understood. So a second World Summit was planned for November of 2005 in Tunis. I was there as an invited guest in the first one. I was there as a speaker in the second one. My wife Patrice, who's in the front row, was actually on the U.S. delegation to both. Although most of the people that were there were governmental people on the official delegation, but she was one of the few non-governmental people there. And so they had a second meeting in Tunis. Hopefully between the first one and the second one, they'd resolve all these issues about who would be in charge of what. And it was very clear that the leaders in industry were not terribly anxious to have the United Nations take over the administration. Partly, it wouldn't evolve very quickly. They would bring, perhaps inappropriate techniques for a very dynamic and fast-moving thing. But at the same time, the internet was actually slowing down because we had so many people on the internet by then. I mean, they were growing from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions to tens of millions. I mean, a large fraction of the world was now part of it, and you couldn't make changes very quickly. So, in fact, there was a natural slowing down that was taking place. So they had a second World Summit in Tunis, and I was actually an invited speaker to that one. But I wasn't actually invited to speak at that one until the 11th hour. And I think the reason was that the plans to actually have control of that taken over by governments of the world didn't materialize. And the United States was adamant in refusing to let go. And so I got a call and asked if I would give one of the keynote speeches in the very opening session, and I did. And my plan was to sort of come up with an alternative approach to one that would leave the United States fragmented and alone in the rest of the world. Well, it turned out I didn't need to give that talk because the night before there was a general agreement among all the parties that the U.S. could continue to provide the oversight for ICANN, which was dealing with some of the protocols, but that and that they would not interfere with the country codes of any of the countries, and that furthermore they would participate, the United States would participate in an ongoing series of discussions, dialogues, whatever you want to call them, on a continuing basis about the future of the Internet. The first of which was held in Athens, Greece, last November, and I was actually asked to participate in that one too. So I was very actively involved in all of the activities, but it was anything but straightforward how this was going to play out. And I think it still is a little unclear to me how it's going to play out, other than the fact that I think most people understand that the United States government is not controlling what's going on. If anything, they would love the private sector to be in charge of what's going on. But the rest of the world doesn't necessarily see it that way, and so we're in a kind of a stasis right now where things are going to play out for the next few years, and we'll see how things actually work out.
Bob, let me, we're running a little late, so I wanted to just close with a couple questions. One is historical and one is a perspective view. The historical question relates to something that came up in the cocktails dinner hour before. One of the people in the audience will probably get up and ask it as a question anyway. But there are a lot of different kinds of historical accounts of the development of the Internet. And a term that John Toole jokingly used when he was talking called fathers of the Internet. How do you respond to all that discussion about the so-called fathers of the Internet?
Well, this is a non-trivial subject you're raising, and many people's kind of careers are sort of tied up with it in one sense or another. It depends on what you mean by the Internet. It depends on, how you want to look at it. I have tended to stay away from the application of labels. This is me personally, because I think the labels don't necessarily tell the whole story. So this is one of those things where success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. In principle, there are hundreds of people who could claim to have made important contributions to the Internet, and they'd be right, ranging from the people who built the workstations, people who worked on protocols, people who built routers. I mean, it's an industry that got spawned out there. And there were people who were involved in this long before the Internet as a network of networks was even a gleam in anybody's eye. Going back to the work that Len Kleinrock did in the early 60s, maybe even before that, on network theory, and the work that Paul Barron did with some of his early studies at the RAND Corporation, some of the ideas that Donald Davies had in England. But I mean, networking really didn't become real until DARPA made the commitment to go build a network. It was called the Arpanet. That was not interneting as we know it today. It was a single network. It was clear the Arpanet wasn't going to take over the world. Nobody was going to be comfortable with a worldwide phenomenon that was all run by an agency of the U.S. Defense Department. Wouldn't happen. But I mean, ARPA put the stake in the ground, and the Arpanet really was a major contribution. But very quickly we saw other contributions. I mean, I was involved in two others as well. I mean, I played a key role in the Arpanet, as everybody knows, but I was also the primary architect of the packet radio system that we built, which had help from lots of people in both deploying. I mean, Bay Area was a major deployment. SRI ran a system out here. We demonstrated it on ships at sea and airplanes. I mean, it was really widely demonstrated. But when you take a look at what's happened over all those years, there were just many things that all played together, and I think when you try and put all the pieces together and just sort of figure out how did that come to pass. There were just a lot of people that were involved doing different parts of it. The roles that the different people played were all important. If you look at it from a synergistic point of view, it really started out really with the work that DARPA did on networking. The Arpanet was the first really big network that was ever deployed. Larry Roberts was the guy that sort of made that happen at DARPA. I don't know whether Larry's in the audience here today, but it was at a time Bob Taylor was running the network, was running the office at DARPA, hired Larry in. And so the Arpanet happened, and that followed through with a major effort to build some other kind of nets that I was principally involved with. I was involved with the Arpanet development. I was involved with the packet radio development. I was involved in the satellite developments to Europe. In parallel with those later things, you had the Ethernet development out here, led by the work that was done at Xerox PARC. There were other network activities as well, and it sort of all got put together into a big composite network system. And I think that many people can take credit for all the things that they did. There was some key ideas that were critical to it. I think that the protocols that we developed were pretty critical to it. I mean, I came into this business as sort of an electrical engineer with a background at Bell Labs, communications kind of background. I sort of ended up sort of backing into the computing side of the world. I didn't start out that way. I teamed up with Vint Cerf. We did some early testing of the Arpanet. Vint was not involved in the network piece of the Arpanet, but he very quickly became involved in the internet side of it. He and I worked together on it because he knew more about the computing side of things than I did, having worked on the early protocol stuff. And Vint was a very close colleague and partner for many years in making that happen. But sort of got into it little by little over the years. A very interesting time, in my life to see that all transpire. I sort of feel more like a computer guy now than I do a communications guy, but my career didn't start out that way. And
so, Bob, just want to wrap it up with a perspective. Just to take a few instances of long-rangedness. Take the internet, for example. The years of formulating the internet ideas were late Arpanet, early internet ideas were around mid-1970s, right? And so you're talking about like
the Arpanet ideas were mid.
Well, Arpanet was in the 60s, but then the transition to the internet, or even including the Arpanet, we're talking now about a sort of a 30-year instant miracle, right? And someday there might even be an artificial intelligence, and then we're looking at like a 100-year instant miracle. How do you view you've had this long-range perspective on packet radio and a lot of technologies, the VLSI over the internet and the internet itself and so on. What's your view of long-rangedness and the excitement and disappointments that can occur that you might have felt over the long term?
Well, I've always had probably a longer term perspective than anybody in industry ought to have. Of course, I never really saw myself in industry hardcore. But to me, it was always a process that I was involved in. I could see a target, I could see a goal. We haven't talked much about what I've been doing the last 20 years.
Well, we ran out of time. But the audience has time to ask you about that.
Yeah, but, if you were to look at it from the perspective of, sort of what's happening, the whole network development was a lengthy development. It did not happen overnight. It wasn't even accepted. The telecommunications industry didn't really, get into this big time until the 90s, I would say. Little by little, it sort of happened. And you just sort of had to be willing to stick with it over the really long haul.
Did you ever feel like you just wanted to give it up?
No, because I was having too much fun. I was just, everything was a new challenge, and I was interested in the technical challenges of it. When I started my career out at Bell Labs, and then later after my doctoral degree, I went to MIT. I thought of myself as having a career in research, just doing research things. The fact that I took a leave of absence to get some practical experience, and ended up designing what became the first computer network, really set me down a different track that I never ever sort of thought of deviating from. It's like, I do whitewater canoeing. And so when you put yourself into a raging rapid, your goal is to sort of work the rapids. And so I've been on a 40-year rapids here, and they've been fun. But every time that you accomplish something, you're always looking at what the next challenge is. And in the late 1980s, after I had left DARPA, when I went to DARPA, I actually had in mind to start a program in automated manufacturing. And it didn't quite pan out. I was interested in it for many different reasons. But when I ended up getting into networking and sort of making that happen big time, I was pretty pleased at the way that ended up working out. But when I left, instead of CNRI, the organization that I've been running for the last 20 years, my goal was to switch focus and do something different. And so I set out to focus on issues of managing information, do a better job of that. And one of the things that I've worked on very hard is digital libraries. One of the areas that we explored a lot was all this mobile agent stuff. That all happened in an era where the patent world hadn't really settled down very much.
I don't think the audience really knows the term for that, but Bob invented the term NOBOT. And I feel I had some role in that because of the Knowledge Systems Laboratory. And they had to get something that had the KNOW in it. But
well,
anyway,
I'm sure there was some influence.
NOBOT is mobile code that migrates on the internet and runs things in other places. And it took Bob, I think, 10 years to get a patent on NOBOT, right?
We got the patent on that in 2003. It was some 15 years after we had really introduced the term or the idea in the first place. It was very hard to get people to kind of understand it. In the late 80s, the patent office was looking more for, tangible things. They really wanted you to sort of build them. They weren't into some of the things that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. But we did get a patent on knowledge, the NOBOT technology, which was kind of shorthand for knowledge robots. And interestingly enough, when we got inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame, they needed to cite the particular patent. And Vint and I were both cited at the time. They cited that patent, even though the work was for the TCP/IP protocols, which were in the public domain. So essentially, we had ceded that to everybody to make use of it. So
what's the bottom line on the long-term perspective?
For what?
For all of us.
Well, I still think we're in a very interesting field. I think that if you look at what's happened in research and development, a lot of the excitement of the field has moved on because much of what we envisioned has been accomplished, but there's an awful lot of what was in some of those early views and what has not yet been uncovered that really has not yet been pursued vigorously enough. And I think, if there's one challenge that I would put forward to the community at large is to think big. Think about the things that are far beyond what you think you can now accomplish and figure out how to get there. When I started working on networking, that's even before the internet. When I first started working on networking, most people in my field thought I was throwing my career away. And that may sound very strange, but they thought there was no there. Most computers were batch machines. The likelihood that time sharing would take off and make a difference seemed very small. And if it did, it would be in a handful of places, and so there'd be no value there and no commercial value. And it seemed to me an interesting technical idea. And so, if there's one message I would give to people, it's if you have an instinct and you really feel strongly about it and you feel like you can make a difference and do something about it, stick with it. Because if I had listened to many of the people in the field back in those days, I would not have gone into networking, because it was just, for them, it was a non-starter. The areas that were, appropriate to work in were things like color television, automatic gain control loops, information theory, things that were more classical, if you will, even microwaves, I guess. Just seemed to me to be an interesting idea, and stuck with it. One of the most interesting things that happened to me in my career was meeting Patrice, my wife, and working with her on some of the intellectual property related issues. Because it turns out doing a good job of managing networking as an informational system really requires that you understand how to manage information, what the rights and capabilities are, and I think we've made a major difference in how people have viewed that whole field and how they've dealt with it. You were mentioning the internet trademark issue was a big issue, that there was some group of banks that wanted to commandeer the term internet and have it applied to their ATM machine equivalents. And we fought that battle. It took about almost 10 years, and that battle got settled. Patrice handled that whole issue behind the scenes, and we finally got it to the point where it was an amicable settlement, but it took about 10 years to get there. And but there have been these little sidebar issues that have been interesting. I still think the world situation is going to play out a lot more. There are not that many people that are all that sanguine about networks the way we see them today. I mean, it's mainly a phenomenon in the more developed countries. There aren't that many computers in the less developed countries. There aren't that many network capabilities. People can't afford them. That's why you see all these efforts to build really low-cost computers, and you see all these efforts to try and figure out how do you get those places wired. Well, they're not going to string wires in the ground. Well, maybe radio is the solution, or maybe some of the technique we haven't yet figured out, gravity waves. Who knows? The future is as wide open as the ideas are of the people who can help to create it. And I still think we're at the very early stage of a revolution that is going to play out through most of the 21st century, if not beyond.
Bob, we've exhausted you in talking, but now we're going to pass the baton to the audience, and you're going to talk more. Great.
Well, I'm happy to do it as long as they want.
We'll let the people get... Are there microphones out there? I've got to get over here where I can see people. Get out of the light. Would you say who you are for the record, so we all know and the video audience knows?
Peter Neumann, SRI.
Hi, Peter.
I am utterly fascinated by an apparent paradox that you've introduced. On one hand, you've pointed out that you are one of the rare guys who has a vision that transcends what is normally possible in industry. On the other hand, you have pointed out that most of the development of the Arpanet, the Internet, and a lot of other things is a very incremental, inertial process where the vision of the long term never seems to be the dominant factor. It's sort of a question of just how can we get from here to the next step in our experimentation. And I'm wondering what advice, if you reach back into your left brain, right brain synthesis sense of putting together the big picture, how do we get into the future that we need to be in terms of highly trustworthy, reliable, secure, highly available, survivable networks and systems of networks in an environment in which the industry itself is not oriented from the point that you raised of thinking out of the box and thinking into the far-sighted future. with the concepts that would drive us into the future in a way.
Well, let me take a crack at that. I mean, I don't have any magic bullets, Peter. I think most of society tends to make progress in incremental steps. I mean, if you ask me, is there anything special about me? I'm inclined to say no in some abstract sense. I've had some people in my family that have been futurists. You probably knew Herman Kahn, who was the classical example of that. I don't quite think I'm very much like Herman, but I've tended to take a long-term view and also at the same time look at what you can do incrementally, sort of like put the two of them together. I mean, if anything, the long-term view is sort of what motivates me, but it's the short-term increments and obstacles and funding that tend to drive you. I mean, I've had my frustrations when I couldn't figure out how to get something funded, or we had to go down that path to get there. But I think I think I was just fortunate. I mean, I had some good long-term views, and I was able to be in a position where I could act on them. I think if I had to put it in a nutshell, for me, it was the freedom from worrying about money in the short term that enabled me to take the longer term view. I mean, it wasn't like that we were very wealthy, but my dad had a little business that he had started, and there was enough support there that I wasn't worried about trying to earn a payroll check. In fact, when I was working at DARPA and maybe even before at BB&N, I used to collect the paychecks, and about every 15 or 20 paychecks I'd deposit them all lump sum, because to me that's not what I was doing. I wasn't earning a paycheck. I was depositing them when I had them from time to time. So I was fortunate to both be interested in the long term and have the ability to work on long term things. That's really where my heart was. I mean, sort of set a goal, figure out how you might get there, even if it's 5 or 10 or 15 years out. Most people don't do that, but you can't work on a 15-year goal, and really hope to get there without worrying about step by step by step by step along the way. I didn't start out that way. I thought I was going to have a career, teaching at MIT. That's what I had started out to do, and I got sidetracked along the way with a very interesting area, which was computer networking, and I ended up just following it for a career. In fact, even after I started CNRI as a research place, I was content, to have it work with smaller funding or larger funding, depending on what the flow was. I mean, this wasn't a matter of stock prices. It was a not-for-profit. It wasn't sort of what are the national problems that need to be worked on, and that's what I did at DARPA too. So I don't know that I have anything more to add to that, other than I was fortunate to be in a position to do that.
Hi, Bob. I'm Jeff Thompson. Rather than this broad sweep question you just answered, I'd like to focus down on a crisp aspect of something in the development. You spoke of the competition between the Internet protocols and the ISO protocols, and the struggle versus top-up versus top-down. I'm interested in what aspect or what contribution to the success of the ISO, or of the Internet protocols, was made by them being freely available versus the sort of retentive position of ISO and only making them available for sale.
I don't think it was the freely available part that mattered. I think it was the available part that mattered.
Well,
in
both
Internet
implementation and documentation, there was this huge mismatch in availability.
I mean, it's one thing to set a group of people loose and have them try things out in various combinations, put things together, versus trying to structure it and plan it top down. I think you saw that tension right there. And I think, let 1,000 flowers bloom won out of, one central manager figuring everything out. I mean, I don't know how many times people have come to me and said, weren't you responsible for figuring out X, Y, or Z? I remember 87 or something, I was at a meeting in New Mexico, and people had put on me the boogie of figuring out the whole field of artificial intelligence. And they said, we understand you figured it out, you planned it, you worked it all out. And I said, no, I didn't. Let me tell you what really happened. We had a lot of inputs and ideas from a lot of people, and we just sifted and sorted them out. But I wasn't really even a player. I didn't consider myself an AI researcher. I didn't think of myself as really participating in that as a technical person. We managed a lot of it. It's really the community that did it. They said, we know that's not true. I never succeeded, and they disinvited me from writing a paper for the thing because they wanted me to write about how I had masterminded it, which, in fact, I had not done.
Hi. Les Ernest, former Stanford bureaucrat, and before that, MIT and MITRE. I'm very interested in the insights you're giving us. Would like to point out one nitpick. Arpanet was not the first large-scale computer network. I believe that honor goes to the Sage Air Defense System, which had 23 computer sites distributed across the two coasts in the northern part of the U.S. and one in Canada. Ran from, I think, 1959 to 1983, used packetized communication, but did not use packet switching as we know it. But the main thing I wanted to say was there's a mystery about how BBN got to build the Arpanet. I wondered if you might have any insights on that.
What's the mystery?
Well, when Larry Roberts put together the startup committee in 1967, he got people from all the prospective sites to participate. I was the Stanford rep, and we put together a request for proposals and eventually got the proposals, which we all reviewed, and had a meeting in Monterey around Thanksgiving in 1968. I thought, there were, I think, around 8 or so proposals. There were only 2 of them that were decent. One was BBN's and the other was Raytheon's. I thought the BBN was the better one, and said so. But when it came to a vote of the committee, it was overwhelmingly for Raytheon. Somehow, 2 months later, BBN was given the contract.
You're powerful.
No.
Yes, you're powerful.
No, I was puzzled but didn't look into it at the time. Some years later, I ran into Larry Roberts and asked him how that happened, and Larry said, I decided. However, a year or so later, I ran into Bob Taylor and asked him about that, Taylor being Larry's boss, and he said, I decided. So, yeah, question is, how did that happen? I still don't know.
What's the question, Les?
Do you have any insights?
You know, the honest answer to that is this is the first time I'm actually hearing that story. The fact that, what I know is that I wrote the technical part of that proposal with help from Severo Ornstein, who helped me on some of the hardware side of the thing. The proposal went in from BB&N. I did not actually expect to be part of the team that was involved in building it. It was never my thought, because I was part of another part of BB&N that was more on the research side. I see Bert Sutherland there. Bert was part of that group. I got involved in that mainly because I didn't see any other way to get my work supported the way the BBN management had structured things. So I figured, well, if that's where the funding is, short term, I'll go and help out. And eventually, I ended up back in a group that Bert was running at the time. But that whole story that you tell me right now, I had never heard that before from any part. So I just can't shed any light on it. I have no idea. Clearly, I thought we put together a good proposal.
Bob, Bert Sutherland retired from Sun in BBN and Xerox way back. Question I want to ask you is about economics of the net. The way it started, it was basically available to use, and that was, I think, in subsidy, very important for the adoption. Right now, I personally wish that every guy who sent me a junk email had to pay a penny for it. So how's that going to play out? How can it transition? I mean, the whole business of the economics of the network has not progressed well enough, in my personal opinion. Do you have any comments?
Well, that's a profound question. So let me ask you this. You get not to leave the mic. I mean,
Yes, sir.
Who would you like to decide for you who should send you email? Do you want people to be able to just send you email and you take the consequence, or would you like would you like Steve Squires to write you a little program that'll filter the mail and give you just the mail that he thinks that you ought to get? How much time does it take you in the course of a day? I mean, I get let's say in the course of a week, I'm just going to round the numbers, I might get 2,000 to 3,000 messages. Of the 2,000 to 3,000 messages, maybe 200 of them are substantive. That is, messages I don't mind seeing. And there are probably 1,800 of those 2,000 that are total junk whatsoever. Yeah, it takes me a certain amount of time to go through it, and I wish it could have been, filtered out some other way. But what would you prefer to see as a mode of interaction, short of having people subscribe to send you email, which I can imagine a system where, people could say, I want to sign up to send email to you, and you could agree on who could send you email, but then you couldn't get it from other parties. Or maybe you could get it from those that you're accredited, the people you want email from, and everybody else's goes somewhere else. It's called a junk mail file or something. But you still have to sort it out because there might be stuff in there you want. What would you suggest as to...
Well, in the large, I think the problem goes down lower than that. Let me just say, I get a huge amount of junk mail in my mailbox, but at least those guys have to pay the postage to get it to me. And if they didn't, if it were free, they thought it were free, I get a lot more. So it's basically not who I'm willing to. I'd like to have an open mailbox, but I'd like whoever sends stuff to me to have to pay for it and want to send it enough to pay.
So you could have one system where everybody pays to send email, just like you send postal mail.
Not an email. Say millions of us send a packet. I mean, I don't care.
Well, that's kind of low leveled. I mean, yeah. So you got 100 messages you want, so you got 100 millionths of a penny to collect.
No, I want the guys who spend 100 million packets to pay for it.
So, I mean...
Okay, well, let's go on to the next question.
I mean, actually, I think the right answer to that question would be to have everybody pay unless the sender is willing to accept their mail without payment, and they get exempted, or maybe there's some number that you get for free, and after that people pay. So that's a whole different economic basis of running email. I think that's accurate.
Well, let me follow up with what Bert was asking and ask you about a specific economic issue. By the way, my name is Phil Gust. A specific economic issue, and that's to do with network neutrality. There's been quite a bit of stuff going on in the last couple of years, regulatory things, as well as policy issues. Could you give us your thoughts on network neutrality? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Where's it going to go?
Well, let me just tell you that term, as far as I'm concerned, is a slogan. So the real question is you got to penetrate down and ask, what is it you're really asking about? If the goal is to encourage people to build new capabilities, then the party that takes the lead in building that new capability is probably only going to have it on their net to start with, and it's not going to be on anybody else's net. If you first require them to get everybody in the world to buy into it so it's uniform and everywhere, that's probably too hard. I think you got to start incrementally and allow things to grow. what does net neutrality try to achieve? Well, one model of it says that the network is just sort of a transport vehicle of some sort, and that all the important stuff takes place on the boundaries. I would take the following position, and this I probably disagree with Vint, who's been very strong on one side of the net neutrality issue, being now a Google rep, but I would probably take the position that organizations ought to be able to provide services, and those services could include functionality that's provided within the net, provided that other parties that then wanted to participate in it could have a way to do that at the boundaries. And if it turns out that it's more efficient to do things inside the net than outside the net, I'm okay with that. I really am okay with that. The time that you run into problems is when, by virtue of doing that, you tend to fragment the net. And anything that will end up fragmenting the net, I'm opposed to, provided it's not an incremental evolution of a new technology that's happening. If you do it by policy that says, that guy can't participate in this, then I would be opposed. You really want organizations to put new and innovative features out on the net. And I think the organizations that produce them should be able to control it. But you'd also like the whole net to be integral. I mean, you'd like it that the fact that somebody is on another net, that they can still participate as part of this internet experience, that we not allow it to fragment. And I think it's possible to make that happen. It's not necessarily in the interest of the organizations putting a new capability out to want to articulate that, because they want to differentiate themselves. But I think this is something that could be done at the policy level, and I think it's the 5% or the 2% piece of the problem that you end up having to work on. It's when things aren't naturally going to evolve in a way that allows the world population to be part of it. You really want to incentivize people to innovate. And if they're going to innovate, they're probably going to innovate on their own nets or with a few other nets that they can work together with. But you'd like them to be able to do that in a way that if other networks want to participate, they can. Because the natural conclusion, if you don't do that, is fragmentation. And I think fragmentation is sort of the inverse of what you want to see in the internet environment. So I am totally opposed to mandating that nothing interesting can happen inside the net. It's just that if interesting things happen inside the net, it ought to be because of consenting nets and not something that will prohibit somebody else from participating if they chose not to do it that way.
Thanks.
What I'm going to ask is that we conclude with these two questions. First this one, then that one.
Roy Mize, I'm a retired person, and I'm a docent here at the Computer History Museum. This is a follow-up on Les's SAGE question. As you know, SAGE was a multiple node system fed by multiple sensors with a very innovative for its time advanced communication system primarily developed by Bell Labs. It stretched over 3,000 miles. To what extent, if any, did any of that work go forward and help support the development of what later became the Arpanet, the Internet, and et cetera? Was it all thrown away, or were we able to use much of that as a support to go forward?
I don't tend to think about it that way. I mean, you can try and draw the parallels and the cross-couplings, but, I mean, the Arpanet project was spearheaded out of DARPA. I mean, they procured a bunch of lines, they commissioned some switches, they engaged the research community, they funded a bunch of things, and if you try and ask what was the correlation with anything else that came before, I'm sure you could probably say, well, ideas here could have influenced that, but I never saw it that way. People have often asked me in the networking world, what was the effect of, let's say, the RAND studies on networking on what I did at BB&N on the Arpanet? And the answer was none, because I didn't actually get to look at those studies until we were partway into it. Now, I became aware of it, in time, but when we were starting to work on it, it was just a task to create something. I mean, I am sure that AT&T, which was providing the lines at the time, wasn't trying to look at something else and learn a lesson. They were just trying to sell some 50 kilobit lines. So I think, you know, you want to be careful not to overreach and look for connections when they don't necessarily have to have been there. I mean, I'm sure the historians will talk about, you know, how A affected B, affected C, and so forth. But, you know, for us involved in that, it was, you know, nose to the grindstone. Let's figure out how to make this happen and get on with it.
Thank you.
Last question.
My name is Brian McMahon, and I'd like to pick up on the issue of fragmenting the Internet. To the extent that it means anything to be connected to the Internet, it really boils down to two things. One is that you have IP connectivity, which means that other providers choose to accept your routing announcements. And two is you have domain names, which means that other people choose to trust the same root as you're registered under. And I'm struck by how amorphous this is and how it completely fails to connect with the way governments think, which is hierarchically.
Which is what?
Hierarchically. There's this persistent fantasy that the Internet is a coherent entity that somebody can control. And that's where a lot of the public policy debate starts to go off the tracks. So how do we protect this fragile web of trust from overzealous regulation?
Well, I mean, how do you protect civility in society? I mean, there are, I mean, it's not like there's a body that's got the charter to deal with this issue, you realize. Nor is there a body that's chartered to make sure the world economy works well, or that other things that are, this is a sort of a multi-party, consensual, collaborative activity of, for which there are very few parallels that I can identify. I think that you know, the really interesting issue about, you know, how things move forward is going to be how we ensure that it stays the way it is. Because there are a lot of forces that want to fragment things. You know, if somebody wants to build a net that's got new capabilities that no other net has, and they want to be protective about it, and that's a fragmentation step. And I think if you have some convention that sort of says, if you have a capability and it can connect to somebody else's, that ought to be a good thing. It's going to have to be motivated by market forces, I suspect. And I think, you know, the people who are making use of this can speak more loudly than anybody, because if somebody provides a capability that won't cross-connect, you know, or doesn't have that ability, then they're probably going to find less in the way of customer base than somebody else who provides a capability that does cross-connect. I mean, we could have easily had an Internet around the world that doesn't have any of the attributes of today's Internet. What is it that forced everybody to want to work together? Now, can things go south? Absolutely. I mean, is the Internet fragile? Absolutely. But, you know, there are an awful lot of things that we hold dear and cherish that are pretty fragile too, and they could go south as well. And I think we just have to be vigilant in maintaining our values and working toward them. But I mean, interoperability to me is a good thing, but everybody who's got a system wants to be able to see it succeed, and everybody is doing, you know, market economics, you know, on their own particular capability. And, you know, in the final analysis, if you end up with something where there's value in the whole, but everybody loses a little in the pieces, it's not going to stand on its own over the long haul. So I think, you know, adjustments will be needed no matter how long, you know, one technology is around. Somebody's going to come up with a way to deal with things that's either different or gives them an advantage. And I think, you know, the Internet as we know it today is a perishable commodity. It doesn't have to be this way, but yet as long as people want it to be this way, my guess is we can make it be this way and improve on it over time.
Thank you. Ed, did you have any other remarks?
So I wanted to not only thank Bob for answering all my questions and all your questions, but I also wanted to thank all of you for gathering here tonight to honor this great man.
Great. And I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the trustees, staff, and all the volunteers and yourself to both Ed and Bob for a wonderful, wonderful evening as we predicted. And thank you all for coming.